Of course, they called themselves the Three Amigos. That is our breaking news tonight. Of course they did. The Washington Post is reporting tonight that White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney organized a meeting in the spring of this year in the White House in which he put the Three Amigos in charge of Ukraine policy. The Three Amigos, as they called themselves, were Energy Secretary Rick Perry, the completely inexperienced Trump ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, and the special U.S. envoy to Ukraine, Kurt Volker. The Washington Post is reporting tonight that Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent testified about the Three Amigos meeting in his under oath closed-door deposition with the House impeachment committees today. George Kent met with investigators today, despite being directed by the State Department not to do that. According to officials familiar with the investigation, the State Department directed George Kent not to appear and sought to limit his testimony. The House Intelligence Committee then issued a last-minute subpoena ordering him to appear, and he complied with that subpoena. George Kent is the second top current State Department official to defy a request not to comply with the House's impeachment inquiry, a request given to him by his employers at the State Department. The first to do that was Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine, who President Trump ordered to be removed from her post. She is still a State Department employee, but she did testify. The New York Times reports George Kent raised concerns to colleagues early this year about the pressure being directed at Ukraine by Mr. Trump and his private lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, to pursue investigations into Mr. Trump's political rivals, according to people familiar with Mr. Kent's warnings. As far back as March, they said Mr. Kent pointed to Mr. Giuliani's role in what he called a disinformation campaign intended to use a Ukrainian prosecutor to smear Mr. Trump's adversaries. Those included former Vice President Joseph Biden, Marie Yovanovitch, then the United States ambassador to Ukraine, and Ukrainians who disseminated damaging information during the 2016 campaign about Mr. Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. Late last night, the New York Times reported that then National Security Advisor John Bolton was alarmed by the Ukraine scandal and told an aide to White House lawyer to tell the White House lawyers what was going on. The Times reports Mr. Bolton got into a tense exchange on July 10th with Gordon Sondland, the Trump donor turned ambassador to the European Union, who was working with Rudolph Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, to press Ukraine to investigate Democrats, according to three people who heard the testimony. That is the testimony of Fiona Hill, President Trump's former top Russia advisor, who testified to impeachment investigators on Monday behind closed doors. According to the New York Times, Fiona Hill testified that Mr. Bolton told her to notify the chief lawyer for the National Security Council about a rogue effort by Mr. Sondland, Mr. Giuliani, and Mick Mulvaney, the acting White House Chief of Staff. According to people familiar with the testimony, I am not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up, Mr. Bolton, a Yale-trained lawyer, told Ms. Hill to tell White House lawyers, according to two people at that deposition. And leading off our discussion tonight, our Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. He's a member of the House Oversight Committee and the House Judiciary Committee. He attended George Kent's deposition today. Also joining us, Jonathan Alter, columnist for the Daily Beast and MSNBC political analyst, and Rick Wilson, Republican strategist and contributor to the Daily Beast. He is the author of Everything Trump Touches Dies. And Congressman Raskin, let me start with you and what you learned, what you can tell us you learned from Mr. Kent today.
Well, I cannot give you any particulars, unfortunately, about his testimony. But let me tell you what I've learned from multiple witnesses who've come forward now from the State Department and the official American bureaucracy. There was basically an unofficial, illegitimate shadow foreign policy being conducted by Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, his henchmen, where they were engaged in the shakedown of the Ukrainian government in order to obtain their agreement to conduct a political hit against the Bidens. And then they covered all of that up and buried it in the secret server, basically selling out our Constitution and our election. But the telephone call, which made all of this infamous, the July 25th call between President Trump and President Zelensky is really just the tip of the iceberg, because this was an ongoing campaign of sabotage in Europe where they targeted a number of people. One of those people was the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who got sacked after a systematic disinformation and propaganda campaign that was waged against her. And she was one of the early casualties of the Giuliani campaign in Ukraine. That's Ambassador Yovanovitch. And I think that was a critical moment for a lot of people in the State Department when they woke up to the fact that Trump and Giuliani were engaged in this effort, totally illicit, to undercut the U.S. foreign policy, which was designed to counter corruption. But Giuliani's team basically connected with the corruption and essentially wanted to take over the corruption racket in Ukraine.
And the New York Times is reporting tonight that there is a kind of a investigation of sorts going on inside the White House, which seems to be what the New York Times is calling a search for a scapegoat. And they are focusing on John Eisenberg. He's the White House counsel for national security. The New York Times quotes people who've seen what's going on in there is saying Mr. Eisenberg is in a precarious position. Congressman Raskin, have you detected in the evidence and the testimony that you've been getting a role that John Eisenberg has played in this that you could tell us about?
Well, unfortunately, I cannot. But I will tell you this. I think that there does seem to be growing sentiment among our GOP colleagues to find some scapegoats, some fall guys. I think that Rudy Giuliani right now is looking pretty lonely. Ambassador Sondland is looking pretty lonely. And I think there may be some effort to try to amputate them from Donald Trump and say, oh, he was the victim of all these people. The problem is that the smoking gun in this investigation is what kicked it off. It was the phone call where Donald Trump reveals himself to be executing the scheme right there. You know, I want you to do us a favor, though. That pretty much captured the entire thing. He knew he was holding up $391 million in foreign military assistance that we in Congress had voted for a besieged Democratic ally resisting Russian aggression, all in order to get President Zelensky to agree to stage this political hit on the guy that Donald Trump was fearing as his opponent, Joe Biden, and his son, Hunter Biden. But what's come out, and what is coming out more and more every day, that this is really just the very top of the cake, if you will. It's baked all the way to the bottom with corruption. And there were financial schemes that were being executed there. There were political schemes that were being executed there, and all of it subverting the legitimate authority of the U.S. government. The cardinal sin of this administration is that the president has converted the public office of the presidency into an instrument of private self-enrichment and political advancement. That is precisely what the founders of the Constitution warned us against. It's why we've got the foreign and the domestic emoluments clauses in the Constitution. It's why the president can't make any other money, and it's why he can't sell us out to foreign powers. But that's precisely what he's been doing on an almost daily basis.
Rick Wilson, they didn't wait for any of us to give them the insulting label, Three Amigos. They proudly gave themselves that title, the masterminds of the Trump-Ukraine policy.
You know, this is a group, you know, the old phrase, the gang that couldn't shoot straight. This is the gang that doesn't even understand that they're setting themselves up for long-term mockery just by that name alone. But what's terrifying for Trump, I think, is that he was so involved in the communications with all of these people. If you're going to be the criminal mastermind, you have cutouts, you have dead drops, you have ways that you're not immediately touching the actual stinky part of the stick. Well, Donald Trump is talking to someone. He's talking to all of these guys, and he's telling them, here's what I want you to say. Here's what I want you to do. He's then out there on the transcript of the call. Then he says it in public over and over again. All these things, you know, they prove that famous thing from Watergate. These are not bright guys, and it got out of control. They're not smart people.
Jonathan Alter, Mike Pence, Rudy Giuliani, both today refusing to comply with subpoenas for documents from the House impeachment committees. And yet we see yet another member of the State Department, currently employed by the State Department, showing up to testify, cracking that wall that the Trump administration is trying to put up.
And Mike McKinley, former ambassador to Brazil and Afghanistan and a couple of other countries, who has been in a senior position in the State Department, he has now resigned, and he is going to testify. So what you have here, Lawrence, is what you could call a patriotic surge. So you remember Steve Bannon coined the phrase the deep state, right? It should be turned into a positive idea, the deep patriotic state. We're fortunate in this country that we have career Foreign Service officers whose allegiance is to the United States and the Constitution, not to the person who happens to be president. And they have served. McKinley, who's going to testify this week, he's been in the State Department since 1982. These are real professionals. They are very smart, capable people who have been trained and are experienced in looking out for the national interest. So there are now many whistleblowers. There's the idea that, this depends on one whistleblower is 3 weeks old. This is about the patriotic state moving in a direction that is very good for the country. So I'm actually encouraged tonight. Are we out of the woods? No, there's a long way to go. There will be bad weeks for those who want to hold Donald Trump accountable between now and the way this story eventually unfolds. But the good guys are going to win because we have enough good guys in government right now.
Well, let's listen to what Chairman Adam Schiff said about why the depositions are being held in a closed-door atmosphere now. Let's listen to this.
We're doing these initial hearings in closed session, and it makes a lot of sense to do that when you're conducting an investigation, because I'm sure the White House would like nothing more than to be able to get their story straight by hearing what these witnesses have to say. And there are good and important investigative reasons not to let one witness know what another witness has said.
Congressman Raskin, this process obviously has similar versions elsewhere in the judicial system for grand juries, for example, and even trials. There are plenty of trials in which witnesses are sequestered during the trial because they don't want the witnesses to hear each other so they can get their story straight. But one of the flaws in that concept here is that presumably the Republican members of your committees, many of them, will relay as much as they possibly can, certainly to the Trump White House, about what's been said in these depositions.
Right. Well, your first analogy, I think, is the most correct one, Lawrence. In an impeachment process, according to the Constitution, the House of Representatives is acting like a prosecutor and a grand jury. In a way, you could view the Judiciary Committee and the other impeachment committees as the prosecutors who will bring before the full House, acting as a grand jury, the evidence, and then the House will vote. At that point, it's sent over to the Senate, which will conduct a trial. I think a lot of our Republican colleagues are falling into the fallacy of thinking of the House as conducting a trial. We're not. The trial will take place in the Senate, and that's the point at which the full due process protections will attach on both sides. Meantime, what we are doing is basically what grand juries do. Some of the prior impeachments have had the benefit of special counsels who were appointed, as with Kenneth Starr in the Nixon impeachment or Archibald Cox in the Archibald Cox and Nixon impeachment, Kenneth Starr in the Clinton impeachment. We don't have that here. Remember, Mueller was very limited and circumscribed in time and scope to just the 2016 election, the Russian influence. Remember, that started as a counterintelligence investigation, but there's not anything about Ukraine there. So we're doing all of that factual assembly ab initio. We're starting it right now. This is the beginning of it, and we really don't have time for all of the kind of theatrics and circus-like atmosphere which the Republicans created in the House Judiciary Committee when we were doing the Mueller investigation. We've got to get right down to business. So we're being very sober, very methodical, and very serious about it. We know that our colleagues would like to recreate the kind of circus atmosphere you saw with the Lewandowski hearing, which was probably the lowest moment in the whole impeachment process that was taking place in the Judiciary Committee. But this is solemn. It's behind closed doors. Now, the Republicans have tried to crash it. Matt Gaetz showed up and said even though he's not a member of any of the relevant committees, he wanted to be there. He delayed everything by 45 minutes or an hour. So we expect future antics and provocations by them. But Chairman Schiff is running a very serious and sober process, and we're getting all the evidence we need, and we're going to get that evidence, and we're going to be able to make some serious recommendations to the Judiciary Committee.
Just briefly, Congressman, before we go to a break here, other than Matt Gaetz and that kind of theatrical interruption that he was doing as much for cameras in the hallway as in the room, the members, the Republican members of the committee and the Republican staff members of the committee who are there, and the committees who are there, are they doing those kinds of theatrical slowdowns that we would see if this was a public event?
Well, we're getting some polemics and some diatribes at the beginning of the hearings, which is to be expected. But I want to agree with what your other guests were saying tonight, that we have this parade of extremely capable, competent, patriotic government servants, public servants who've spent decades working in the government and working to advance the public interest. And the juxtaposition is so striking between them and the kinds of people that we're talking about in the Trump administration that I think it has somewhat shamed and embarrassed our colleagues, and they're acting increasingly sheepish as these hearings go along. These are people who are standing up for the Constitution. They're standing up for the government of the United States against these constant efforts to rip off the government, to undermine American democracy, and to shake down foreign allies. It's a very sordid tale that's being revealed here. And when it's all done, there are going to be some people who live in infamy because of what they've done. And there are going to be some people who live their lives in a very respectable and honorable way. And they will be quiet American heroes.
Now, Congressman, you're making me feel really sorry for Rick Wilson that he can't watch the Republicans on those committees being shamed and embarrassed and sheepish. But we're just going to have to wait for the public
It's
hearings.
coming. It's coming. I bet you there will be some public hearings before it's all over.
We're going to have to leave it there for tonight. Congressman Jamie Raskin, Jonathan Alter, Rick Wilson, thank you all very much for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.